In a small town in America, there was once a baker who ran a little shop on the corner of a busy street. Though his bread was the softest, freshest, and most delicious in town, and his cakes were famous for their rich, buttery flavor, the baker himself was not a warm or generous man. He never offered a kind word to his customers, never smiled, and never gave anyone even a little extra for their money. He measured each portion with precision, ensuring that no one received a crumb more than what they paid for. Despite his gruff nature, people flocked to his bakery, drawn in by the irresistible aroma of fresh bread and sweet pastries. The scent would drift through the streets, filling the air with warmth and comfort, making mouths water as passers-by caught a whiff. Some people stepped inside, eager to exchange their coins for a loaf of his famous bread or a golden, flaky croissant. Others, however, simply stood outside, taking deep breaths of the delicious air, enjoying the scent of something they could not afford. The baker hated those people. He watched them from behind his counter, his face twisting with irritation. To him, they were thieves, stealing the scent of his hard work without paying a single cent. Their stomachs are full of the smell of my bread, and I get nothing for it, he grumbled to himself. I work from dawn until dusk, kneading, baking, sweating, and what do? They take in my delicious smells for free. If only I could capture those scents in a bottle and sell them. Then even the air around my bakery would bring me profit. One bitterly cold winter morning, before the sun had fully risen, the baker was already in his shop, preparing dough for the day's first batch of bread. The shop was warm, filled with the golden glow of the ovens and the comforting crackle of firewood. Outside, however, the world was still blanketed in snow, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional crunch of footsteps on frozen ground. As he worked, grumbling about the early hour and the chill in the air, his eyes flicked toward the shop's window. Standing there, motionless, was a young man in a threadbare coat, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His face was thin, his cheeks slightly hollow from hunger, but his expression was one of quiet contentment. His eyes were closed, and he took slow, deep breaths, savoring the scent of fresh bread as though it were the most wonderful thing in the world. The baker's temper flared. He slammed his rolling pin onto the counter. That thief, he muttered under his breath, standing there, stealing my smells without paying a penny. His anger boiled over as he strode across the shop, yanked open the door, and pointed a finger at the young man. You, pay me, he barked. The young man's eyes flew open in surprise. Pay you? He asked, bewildered. For what? For the smells you've been stealing? You've been taking in my bread scent, enjoying it without paying for it. That's as good as stealing a meal from my shop. The young man frowned, shaking his head. But I haven't taken anything, he said. I was only breathing the air. Air is free, isn't it? Not when it's full of the smells from my shop, the baker snapped. You've been enjoying my hard work without giving me anything in return. Either pay me right now, or I'll have you arrested. The young man looked at the baker, then at the steaming loaves of bread behind him, and then back at the snow-covered street. He had no money, only the clothes on his back and a handful of coins barely enough to buy a crust of bread. I don't have anything to pay you, he admitted. Then you'll come with me, the baker growled, grabbing the young man's sleeve. Without another word, He dragged him through the cold morning streets, pulling him along until they reached the house of the town's judge. It was still early, and the judge had been asleep when the loud knocking on his door startled him awake. He groaned, rubbing his eyes, and shuffled to the door in his nightclothes. When he opened it, he found the furious baker standing outside, his grip tight on the arm of a bewildered young man. "What is the meaning of this?" the judge asked, his voice thick with sleep. "It's barely sunrise. What could possibly be so urgent?" "This man is a thief," the baker declared. "He has stolen from me." The judge raised an eyebrow, glancing at the young man, whose thin hands were empty. "I see no stolen goods," he said slowly. "What exactly has he taken?" "The smell of my bread," the baker insisted, his face red with frustration. "He's been standing outside my shop, filling his stomach with the scent of my hard work, and giving me nothing in return." The judge stared at him for a moment, then sighed. "Come inside," he said. "Let me hear the full story." He led them into his study, where the warm glow of a lantern flickered across the walls. The three men sat around a large wooden table, the judge rubbing his temples as he listened first to the baker's accusations and then to the young man's quiet defense. "I took nothing," the young man said simply. "I only breathed the air. How can that be stealing?" The judge was silent for a long moment, tapping his fingers against the table. The baker leaned forward, eager for a ruling in his favor, while the young man simply waited, his face unreadable. Finally, the judge spoke. "I have made my decision," he said. The baker sat up straighter, ready to collect his payment. "Young man," the judge continued, "do you have any money at all?" The young man hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a few small coins, his last bit of money. He held them out to the judge. "This is all I have," he said quietly. The judge took the coins and examined them, rolling them between his fingers. Then he closed his fist around them and shook his hand, making the coins clink together. The sound rang through the silent room. The baker's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Finally, my payment," he said, stretching out his hand. But the judge did not give him the money. Instead, he held up his hand and said, "Wait." Then, with a knowing smile, he turned to the baker and declared, "The sound of money is the perfect payment for the smell of bread." For a moment, there was complete silence in the judge's study. The baker's smile faltered, his outstretched hand still waiting for the coins that never came. He blinked, his mind racing to make sense of what he had just heard. "The sound of money?" he repeated slowly, as though the words themselves were foreign. "Yes," the judge said, placing the coins back into the young man's hand. "You demanded payment for the smell of your bread, did you not? And I have ensured that payment was made. You have received the sound of coins in return for the smell of your work. A fair exchange." The baker's face turned red. His lips parted in outrage, but no words came out at first. When he finally found his voice, it was sharp with anger. "But that's not real payment. I can't spend the sound of coins." "And yet," the judge replied calmly, "you expected this young man to pay for something just as intangible. You wished to charge for something he never took, only experienced. If a scent can be stolen, then so can a sound. And now, you have been paid in full." The young man, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, stared down at the coins in his palm, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then a slow smile spread across his face. He clenched his hand around his money and stood up, bowing slightly toward the judge. "Thank you, sir," he said. "You are a wise and fair man." The baker, however, was far from satisfied. He glared at the judge, his hands clenched into fists. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "This is an insult. I demand real money for my work." The judge leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. His voice remained calm, but there was a firmness to his tone that left no room for argument. "Baker, you are a skilled craftsman. Your bread is the best in town. But your heart is as hard as an old loaf left too long in the cold. Instead of feeling pride that your work brings joy, even to those who cannot afford it, you treat kindness as a debt to be collected. If you do not learn to find happiness beyond money, you will live a miserable life." The baker opened his mouth to protest, but something in the judge's gaze stopped him. He gritted his teeth, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. "Go home, baker," the judge said, his voice softer now, "and think about what truly has value in this world." With that, the case was closed. The young man tucked his coins safely away, offered one last grateful nod, and stepped out into the cold morning air. The baker, grumbling under his breath, stomped back to his shop, his anger weighing heavier than the scent of his own bread. As the days passed, people in the town continued to stop outside the bakery, inhaling the warm, delicious air. The baker still scowled at them, still muttered to himself about thieves of smells. But he never again dragged anyone to the judge's house. Perhaps deep down he had learned something after all.